Hey there, in this series we are going to be deploying a Python web application from scratch onto a Linode virtual machine. Now if you've never used Linode, it's a fast, reliable, and affordable way to provision a server or a virtual machine that you can use at any time. And it's as low as $5 a month. Now the cool thing for me about Linode is I actually learned how to deploy my first Python web application on Linode about 10 years ago, which is crazy to think, but it's a really exciting time to learn how to do these fundamental things because they will help you a lot as you start to deploy more applications onto the internet and to the cloud. Now, more practically speaking, what we're going to be doing is we're going to learn about Nginx, we're going to learn about version control, also known as Git, and we're actually going to be using our Linode server to be our production Git repository, so we're actually going to store our code both locally on our normal computer and then also on our Linode server. Now, I think this is alone a really useful exercise to have and to know about, so you don't always have to rely on third-party services to host your code, which I think is important. So you can actually have it in multiple places instead of just one. Now, the other cool thing about this is actually deploying a proper web application that anyone in the world can use and see within a matter of minutes. Now, if you've never done this before, of course, it might end up taking a few hours to get there, but once you do it a couple times, then it's going to start to get down closer and closer to only a few minutes to deploy a full-on web application for only a few bucks a month, which I think is amazing. Now, the key thing here is we need to go through all of this to really understand it. So be sure to subscribe because this is a multi-part, multi-video series. If you don't subscribe, you probably won't see the future ones, or at least you won't know about it first. My name is Justin Mitchell. I'm working with Linode on this one because I think it's incredibly important for you guys to learn these fundamental skills because they translate all across different cloud services as well. It just so happens that Linode is one that is near and dear to my heart because of the fact that I learned so long ago. So I'm really excited to get started, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we'll be doing in this series specifically. All right, let's do a quick walkthrough of what it is that we're going to be doing and why. Now, first and foremost, we are going to be deploying a Python web application onto a Linode virtual machine using as cutting-edge technology as you possibly can. And here's the end result. Wow, that is riveting. This is like mind-blowingly cool. Now, you're probably not thinking that, right? This is really not that big of a deal as far as the end result is concerned, but getting here, if you've never done this before with a Python web application, you're going to learn a lot of very valuable things that you can do over and over again with all kinds of applications, not just Python. So let's actually take a look at the technologies we'll be using to get to this point. Of course, I've mentioned Linode, and it is a very affordable way to learn how to provision virtual machines and deploy virtual machines into the cloud, as well as all your code and all that. So that means that we have to learn how to do a secure shell or SSH and bring in all of our necessary keys to even get Linode working in the first place. That's like very fundamental to connecting to any cloud provider, but especially something as straightforward as Linode. Next, we're going to be using Nginx. Now, Nginx is actually the web server that's going to be really running so much of our application. So the cool thing about Nginx is we could actually have stuff like Python Fast API, Python Flask, Python Django. We could have all three of those projects working under the exact same IP address or domain name. And Nginx handles all of that stuff and handles it very well. Next, what we're going to be using is a technology called Git. This is great for version control. I'll go into it a lot more when we get there, but the idea is that, well, we make changes to our code over time. We want to make sure that those changes are tracked. Git allows that to happen, which also allows me to, make changes locally and send them into production with very little difficulty. So it's pretty easy using Git once you understand some of the basic commands that we'll go over. Next, of course, we are going to be using a tool called gUnicorn. gUnicorn is fundamental for all kinds of Python web applications. So if you've ever deployed a Django web application, there's a really good chance you use gUnicorn. And if you've ever deployed a Fast API web application using UVicorn, Gunicorn is the next level of that to make sure that we have production ready web server, which, this is just configuration. We'll get into it. It's, I think it's pretty straightforward, but every once in a while, little configuration things just need to be worked through. And that's a big key of all of this. Next, what we're going to be using is something called Supervisor. Supervisor allows our actual Gunicorn and web application to run in the background. So it sort of manages that process. And if it goes down or if it breaks down, Supervisor will bring it right back up, which is really, really cool. Next, we're going to be using Fast API. This is a Python web framework. This is a incredibly fast Python web framework for building APIs first. So it's primarily for building REST APIs. Now, we only scratched the surface of what's possible with Fast API, but the reason I ended up doing it is because, well, it's a really popular tool right now, and it's really, really easy to get started, even if you have only a little bit of experience with Python. And I actually want to reiterate that with all of this stuff. This is meant to be for those of you with, well, just a little bit of experience, not too much experience. And if you do have a lot of experience, you're going to probably fly through this and it's going to be really useful for you as well. And the next thing is we're going to be using Jinja 2. Jinja is a templating engine that actually works well with Fast API and other tools like Flask. Jinja was inspired from the Django templating engine, so it's very similar to that if you've come from Django. So both of them are working hand in hand. And then, of course, this is the actual result that we'll end up seeing. And all of that will be on our code on our GitHub. I'll be sure to have links for this in the description so you can have any reference that you might need. Now, why is it that we're doing all these things in this fashion? Well, to me, it's about learning to be as resilient as possible to changes in the cloud environment and going from the fundamental Linode, that is the fundamental virtual machine, all the way to a production web application is not something that everyone knows how to do, but I think it's incredibly important if you are going down this journey of building web applications at all. So yes, of course, if you weren't using Python, if you want to use Node.js or Express.js, you can absolutely use the vast majority of this to run those things. And I do recommend that you at least learn the basics of deploying with other languages if you are coming from a different world. But Python, being as popular it is for these kind of languages, is another reason as to why we're doing that. So really, before you even get too deep into all of the cloud services that are out there, to me, this is one of those fundamental things that you should learn and understand. And luckily for us, Linode is, well, very inexpensive. It's an affordable option to actually use these virtual machines. So let's go ahead and actually take a look at what I recommend that you have before we actually jump in to getting started. All right, so these are my recommendations for getting started with this one. The first and fundamental thing when you are learning how to program and getting into cloud computing is tenacity. If you don't have tenacity, if you're not willing to go through some of the challenges you will certainly face, then maybe this isn't for you. But for everyone else who's ready to take on these challenges, here are the practical things that you should have. Some sort of laptop or desktop. That is, of course, using a Windows, an Apple, Linux, something that's not in a mobile device. I mean, you probably could do a lot of these things with those mobile devices, although I wouldn't recommend it. And if you can't afford to buy a new computer, you could even use a Raspberry Pi with an old computer screen or whatever. It's just as long as you have a keyboard and mouse, you should be good to go as far as your actual hardware requirements. Next, I would actually recommend that you have some Python experience. I think this will be good for the Python side of things. Now, of course, if you've never done Python before, then you could always check out my 30 Days of Python series prior to this one, because once you do, even up to like day 15 or so, once you actually have experience using Python, it's going to make things a little bit easier for you. Now, I'm going to be walking you step by step in all of this, but depending on where you are, some things might go too fast and then some things might go too slow. So having a fundamental understanding of how Python works, I think will help you a lot in this series. And then next, actually downloading and installing a text editor. The one I recommend is VS Code or Visual Studio Code. I will actually come back to this again later, but if you download it now, it's not going to hurt. This is actually where we will type in a lot of different commands. So that's really the fundamental recommendations I have before you jump in. Of course, if you have any questions whatsoever, let me know in the comments, and I will do my best to have everything linked in the comments for resources that you'll need to actually get going, such as the actual code, the repo, the reference code that I talked about in the walkthrough, and then also the 30 Days of Python series, because I think that will be incredibly helpful for you. So again, let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and provision our first virtual machine on Linode. It's really easy to do, but I'm going to assume that you already have a Linode account, like you've already signed up and you are already logged in and you see something like this. So if you haven't created a Linode account, be sure to do that on linode.com and then sign in. Now, to do this, it's incredibly simple, and we're going to do it a couple of times because when I was learning, I was really hesitant to do it a couple of times because I didn't want to get charged a lot. Linode is already affordable, so you won't get charged a lot anyway unless you provision something that could charge you a lot. But I want to get used to actually deploying and creating different Linodes. So inside of our console, we're going to go ahead and click Create and click on the tab for Linode. Of course, if you go into the tab for your Linodes, you might see some in here if you've done this before, or you would actually go ahead and create one there as well. So let's go ahead and create our first Linode by clicking on that. I actually opened a new tab so we can sort of see the difference as to what's going on. And we're going to go ahead and start with the distribution. What does this mean exactly? Well, this is basically what Linux operating system version do you want to use? There's quite a few of them, as you can see in this drop down here. But I'm going to stick with Debian 10. Now, I think you should stick with some version of Debian as well, ideally 10 or later, just so you can follow along with all of this. Next, we're going to go ahead and select our region. Now, this is going to be the best location for your end users when you want end users. While you're learning, you want to put it as close to you as possible. And of course, they have a speed test page to help you figure out what that best region is. But I think just picking a city or an area that's near you is probably ideal, right? So I'm in California, so I'm going to go ahead and use Fremont, California. But of course, if I was in London, I would use London. If I was in Mumbai, I'd use Mumbai, Sindhi, all those places, right? Okay, cool. So region, distribution, no big deal. Next, the actual plan that you want to use. Obviously, you can pick what best suits you, but I'm going to go ahead and pick the Nanode because it is really cheap hourly, right? So we're actually going to do a few of these in just a minute. Next, you can label this. You can always change this label later. And then our root password. Now, this is actually critical for what you need to do. You actually need to have a really secure root password. And I actually recommend using Chrome or Safari or Firefox's suggestion for what that password might be, right? So in this case, this is my password. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, and I'm going to make note of it on VS Code, right? Or some text editor of some kind. Just leave it there for now. Don't worry, we will come back to this and adjust later. But for now, we have that root password in there. If you know what SSH keys are, well, that's something that we need to do first. So I haven't even touched SSH keys yet, so we'll not worry about that yet. We don't attach a VLAN yet either, unless you know what you're doing there. And that's pretty much it. So we just really select a distribution, a region, a plan, and add a password. And then boom, we can go ahead and create a Linode. And my last test on this, I actually had a Nanode running for just about 3 hours. Not quite 3 hours, like 2.5 hours. And it cost me 3 cents, right? So I actually have some credits, which you might as well, that this actually cost me $0, as well as object storage, right? So object storage is a whole other thing that we could talk about some other time. But for now, just keep in mind that, just having it up for a few hours costs 3 cents. So it's a really easy way to learn. And if you start getting good at this, what will happen is you will be able to do this in no time. You'll be able to resume where you were in no time. And I actually think it's a really good challenge to go through this entire series, provision everything, set everything up, and then do it again and again, right? So I'm really hoping that you take it several times or do it several times. Okay, so while it's provisioning, we see really interesting things about it, right? So we see this IP address here, and we also see the SSH access. Now remember, I mentioned that SSH key before. Now if you're on a Mac, a Linux of any kind almost, and a Windows, you have access to SSH by default. Windows has it in a tool called PowerShell. Mac and Linux users have a tool called Terminal. This is the command line. SSH stands for Secure Shell. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but it's probably worth checking out the Wikipedia article if you want to read more about it. But the general idea is I want to be able to write commands on this actual Linode. But before we do any of that, let's just actually let it finish provisioning. And while it's running, I'm going to go ahead and create another Linode. And as you see, now that I've actually created one of them, I can go ahead and easily create another one. Right, so again, Debian 10. This time I'm going to go ahead and do Dallas, Texas. And I'll do again the Nanode plan. I'll scroll down a little bit. The label is fine. You can obviously change the label. Right now it's using that exact same password that I had before, which in this case is fine, right? I don't really need to get a new password, but if I wanted one, I should be able to get a suggested password in here as well with a control click on Mac and a right click on Windows. So suggest password, it doesn't seem like it's doing it, which is fine. You can use the same password again, which is exactly what I'm doing. And so again, this is for testing, right? So when you go into production, when you actually need these things fully secure, do not do what I just said. There's a lot of different ways on how to secure that password a little bit better. But while I create this, I just go ahead and run it. And what we see here is in our Linodes, it's now provisioning in two different places. And we can just keep provisioning Linodes for as many as we need. And at any time, we can go ahead and go into our settings and we can delete that Linode, right? So in the case of the Texas one, I don't actually need this one, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it. Now, that was so uncomfortable for me for a very long time, but now that I know what I'm doing, it's really easy to do. But also, I want to emphasize as a beginner, you should do this over and over. Just get really comfortable with deleting things you don't need anymore. And we'll talk about strategies to make sure that we don't delete our code, the things that we do need. But when it comes to things we don't need, just delete it. Just be very, very comfortable with that. All right, so I'm going to let this finish, and then we will go ahead and pick up from there. After a few minutes, our Linode came online, and it's now running. And there's two ways to connect to this Linode. Like, how do we actually get into it? Now, the way we're going to end up using is called SSH, or the secure shell, like I've mentioned. And there's another way, which is called the Lish console. This is the Linode shell. So I can actually log in to my Linode account and use the Lish console to do all of the same commands that you would do with SSH. Now, this is great when you are not on your local development environment and don't really want to set up SSH on that environment, like we will in a moment. So if you actually launch this, what you'll see is the console, and the login will be root. That's the standard username that comes in with this. And then the password would be that password you set that we just stored on VS Code or any text pad. And you type that in or paste it in, and there we go. So we actually are in a secure shell right now through Linode. Now, there's a number of things that we still need to do with this, but the general idea is we can use the Lish console to actually write out all of our commands and do everything that we need to do. And we can, do stuff like pip freeze. Unfortunately, pip is not installed yet. Python's installed. Hey, that's cool, but it's 2.7, right? So there's still a lot of configuration that we need to do, but we want to do that using SSH. So let's go ahead and set up SSH on our local system. Now, the big reason that we even use SSH is so we can actually really write all of our code locally and handle all of the main configuration for our project on our local machine. This is incredibly common for professional developers to use, and you should as well. And the reason I'm using VS Code in the long run is because it's right now one of the best free tools out there to write code and to actually use the terminal or PowerShell. So the first step in getting our local machine to work with our Linode is to actually use SSH like this. So what we want to do then is we want to open up our command line. Now this command line tool, if you're on Mac and Linux, is called Terminal. If you're on Windows, it's going to be PowerShell or PuTTY. Windows also has something called Command Prompt, but Command Prompt does not have SSH by default. So if you don't have PowerShell on your local machine, use PuTTY. But once we are all inside of our Linode, it's going to work the same. So worst case scenario, you Windows users, you could get away with a lot of this using the Lish console, but the vast majority of it, I do recommend that you're working locally. So let's go ahead and do our first login to SSH. It's incredibly simple, as our Linode service shows us. This right here, right? So what this is saying is, hey, computer, or hey, command line, use the secure shell protocol and go into with the user of root to this IP address. This will not be your IP address. I mean, there's a very slim chance that it will be, but more than likely you will have a different IP address. So this will allow us to log in. Let's go ahead and try it. I'm going to give it a copy, and we'll go ahead and go into terminal or PowerShell or PuTTY and bring that in. So SSH, root, at, all of that. We hit enter, and it's going to ask you this question right here, right? So this is a security feature that your local version of SSH has. So if you've never actually gone into this before, you will pretty much always see this. Now, I'll show you where this is stored later, but for now, we're just going to go ahead and say yes and hit enter. Okay, so it adds it to a list of known hosts. The next thing is it's asking for our password. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-C. I'm going to cancel out that process and press up, press enter, and try to SSH again. This time, we no longer see that actual question, right? So once you do it once, it's not necessarily going to need to do it again. So the question again is, what is this password? Well, hopefully you remember, but as a reminder, it's when we actually created our Linode and we set this password down here, this root password, right? So all we need to do here is enter what that password was. Now, in my case, I have it stored on my text editor of VS Code, like we literally just did, and I can copy and paste that in here. Now, when it comes to password on any command line, if it's done correctly, you won't see the password at all. That's true with Lish, that's true with this. If you see the password, you're probably not in the right area or not using a secure tool at all. So I don't recommend using those tools that expose your password while you're typing. But anyways, I hit enter, and what do you know? I'm in the roughly the exact same place as I was before. So to just really test this out, just at a simple level, I'm going to leave the SSH running here, and I'm going to go back into the Linode console and jump in to my Linode here that I just SSH'd into. I'm going to launch this Lish console, and I'm going to go ahead and notice that I didn't actually have to do the typing again. I didn't actually have to type in, but I'm going to go ahead and say touch hello-world.txt. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I'll do ls to list everything out. If you're from the Windows world, you're probably familiar with dir. That is roughly the same command, but dir doesn't work on every version of Linux, where ls will, and it'll also work on Mac. So we see that hello world is there, right? This is on the Lish console. So to verify that we're in the right place on our local machine, we go back into whether it's terminal, PowerShell, or PuTTY. We are currently logged in. I can do ls, hit enter, hello world.txt is there. Now, granted, I didn't show you what was there before, so we could test it again and say touch hello u.txt, hit enter, go back into that Lish console, hit ls, and what do you know? There it is. So it's probably a really simple, probably not a great way, but a simple way that you could potentially communicate with two people on the actual same machine. Kind of silly to do it that way, and it's probably not the most secure way to communicate. But the general rule here is, hey, we can actually use both of these at the same time on that root user account. So that's how we actually connect. We now know how to connect. It's a couple different ways on how we're going to do it. But here going forward, I'm going to be using the terminal for it, or PowerShell. And most of the commands, if not all of the commands, will be identical across these machines. But of course, if you run to any issues and you solve those issues, let us know in the comments so that we can actually help all of us get this down. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. I realize what we covered is not great for everybody, but it is necessary to make this project happen. And that's just really what it's all about here. Is I want to help you make your projects happen, because I remember what it's like. I remember struggling through all of those things and then really feeling like I'm not going to get through it. And then right when I felt that way, I just always kind of got over it. And that's why I'm here. I want to help you just get over that last hump of some of the challenges you are facing with your projects. So if you are facing any of those challenges, let me know in the comments below, because either myself or someone on the Linode support team will help reach out to you to get those things done. And of course, if you did like this, it helps me a lot if you subscribe and actually thumbs up this video, and maybe even share it to a friend or whatever you want to do. But the idea is, the more we hear from you guys, the more you interact with this, the more videos we can produce together. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.